A man found abandoned as a baby outside an Oxford Circus department store during the war finally has some answers, but fears he will go to his grave without knowing why his parents left him. Robin King, now 74, was dumped in 1943 and only found out he was adopted when he was 13. He had been digging through what he thought was his biological parents' belongings when he found his adoption papers in a holdall. Traumatized by what he had discovered, the teenage Mr. King fled to a friend's house before the pair of them cycled from London to Southend, where they spent 3 days sleeping in a tent before the police picked them up. Robin King, now 73 and pictured here with his daughter Lorraine, was found abandoned as a baby outside an Oxford Circus department store during the war. Mr. King, pictured here with daughters Lorraine and Michaela, only found out he was adopted when he was 13. Mr. King, left, as a child, grew up in poverty-stricken Woolwich, South London, having been adopted by Fred and Elsie King, right, just after World War II had finished. My friend's mum had to pay for us to come back on the train, Mr. King told the BBC. The subject of his adoption was never brought up and he feared raising it in case it caused a confrontation. Mr. King grew up in poverty-stricken Woolwich, South London, having been adopted by Fred and Elsie King just after World War II had finished. Leaving school with few qualifications, he endured a tough time but in his 20s got married and started a family, raising his 2 daughters in Peterborough. He worked as a town planner and later as an architect and praised his daughters as the only 2 people he shared a biological bond with. It was only years later when he applied for a passport he found out he had been left at the Peter Robinson store in London. A passport official delivered the hammer-blow news, and Mr. King realized why his first name was Robin and his second name was Peter. But it was not until 1996 when Mr. King, by now in his 50s, decided to delve deeper into his origins. Daughter Michaela went to the London Metropolitan Archive to collect his full adoption records and he discovered he was abandoned on October 20, 1943, while Hitler's Luftwaffe was still pounding the capital with bombs. The file revealed he had been adopted by the Kings when he was already 4.5 years old, and they had thanked the adoption board for giving them such a good little boy. Mr. King spent most of his life not knowing who his biological parents were, but in a remarkable story he tracked them down to the other side of the Atlantic. Mr. King's parents were revealed as Canadian airman Douglas Jones and his wife Agnes, who had met in Glasgow before settling in Douglas native Canada. Remarkably, Mr. King was able to track down and meet Trevor Hill, one of the men who discovered him wrapped in a blanket in wartime London. But, crucially, there was no clue as to why his biological parents had left him on the street. Over the next 20 years Mr. King's daughter Lorraine continued the search, getting in touch with every expert she could think of, but the replies were all the same, without the parents' names. It was an impossible task. Finally there was a breakthrough when they got in touch with a genealogy expert, who found a DNA match.